기분 양육전 기본 요전 기승 중륜론
7. Korean Seon, Zen. This brings us to the main point of our inquiry, the significance of the Korean Seon, Zen, for the study of the Seon tradition in China. I would like to make a few observations and suggestions for future work. The thrust of these comments will be to examine the history of the introduction of the Seon approach to Korea. As we consider the materials coming from those early practitioners, it should at the very least provide us with supporting documentation for the studies that center on China. In order to follow through with this type of research, we can note that there were 8 famous Korean masters who went to China during the Tang dynasty and returned to Korea to start their own lineages in mountain monasteries. These masters are of interest to us, not only because of their activities in Korea, but also because they were trained in China. Receiving the instruction of Seon monks, the Korean Seon, Zen masters represent one way of looking at the ideas and methods that were contemporaneous in the Tang dynasty. As we look at the biographies of the 8 Silla dynasty Seon, Zen masters, we have the following information about them. The first one to go to China was Tuai. He stayed in China for 34 years, returning to Korea in 818. His teacher was Shi Tiang Chi Tsung from the lineage of Matsu. He studied with this master for 20 years. When Tuai returned to Korea, he lived for 7 years and during that time started his training of local disciples, who established a center at Porum Sa more than 3 decades after the master's demise. At the same time that Tuai was working with Shi Tiang Chi Tsung, 2 other Korean disciples went to be trained. Hung Choke arrived in 810 and Haiko El in 814. Hung Choke stayed in China for 16 years and Haiko El for 25. Only after the death of Shi Tiang Chi Tsung in 814 did any of them leave China. When Hung Choke had returned to Korea in 826 at the age of 54, he soon established his center at Silsang Sa. After the 3 Koreans had gone to study with Shi Tiang Chi Tsung, a 4th followed them to China in 821. Muam went to work with Maku Pao Che. Muam stayed in China for 24 years, going home in 845 and setting up his center of mediation at Seon, Zen, USA in 847. 3 years later Hyanuk set out for China and was to stay for 13 years doing study with Chang Ching Huaihui. After his homecoming in 837, he lived and taught for 32 years and his disciples established a center for the continuation of the school in 897 at Pongnim Sa. The year following the departure of Hyanuk for China, Toyun arrived in the Tang kingdom and chose Nan Chuan Pun to be his master. He also had a long stay 22 years before going back to Korea in 847 and establishing a center in 850 at Hungneong Sa. From these examples of Seon, Zen masters who studied in China, we see that there was a steady stream of Korean monks going and returning from China with contacts among a variety of Seon masters from 784 to 911. They lived in China and studied until after the death of their Chinese masters. They had a protracted stay in China, all for more than a dozen years and some for 3 decades. When these monks returned to Korea, they were themselves mature people. For example, Haiko El was 54 on his return, Hyanuk 50, Toyun 50, Iam 42. We see that the Seon, Zen monks of Korea usually went to masters who were well known and already aged. The first 3 Korean students of Shi Tiang came to him in his later life. Tuai joined Shi Tiang when he was 50, Hong Chok when he was 75 and Haiko El during his last year of life at 79. Pommel joined his master when Yen Quan was 81, and Toyun met Nan Chyoen when the master was 77. This means that Korean Zen monks were being taught by mature and revered masters of the Tang Chon tradition. They sought after the established leaders. The impact of the group was great for Korea. Within a 50-year period, 7 of the 9 mountain Zen monasteries were established as places where their heritage was continued by generations of disciples. Thus the Chinese Chon was transplanted in the 9th century into the main fabric of Korean Buddhist institutions. While the older scholastic schools of the unified Silla had been the center of Korean life during the 7th and 8th centuries, Zen carried the day in the 9th, and Korean Buddhism was never the same. A. Transmission of the Dharma. It is important that we understand the importance of these monks in looking at the history of the Tang Buddhist developments. The teachings of the 8 Korean Zen monks constitute a major source for our study of Chon, but one which has been little used by Chinese scholars. During the 9th century, we can track the developments in China which must have been part of the experience of the Zen monks. There were 5 distinct groups of the southern school of Chon. Shen Hui, the founder of this school, had been victorious over the so-called northern schools. The disciples of Shen Hui held to the principle that the transmission of the Dharma was one of the most important and sacred moments in Buddhism. Without a clear understanding of the way in which this transmission occurred, there could be no assurance about the authenticity of it. There is some indication in the older Indian tradition of the transmission of the teaching from one teacher to another. We have the example of the Sakyamuni giving the Dharma over to his disciple Mahakasyapa. But even in the Indian materials, the idea of single transmission is eroded when we look at the Astasahasrakaparjana Paramita Sutra, where the transmission for that text is given from Sakyamuni to Ananda, not to Mahakasyapa. For the newly emerging southern school, there was the idea that transmission could only be given to one individual in a generation. They used the analogy of kingship, saying that a nation could not have more than one king, and Chon could not have more than one master in one generation. The venerable Taiwanese master Yin Shun has challenged this view of a single transmission. Yin Shun recognizes that a major issue was over the idea of whether there was one transmission of the Dharma in every generation. This would mean that it was crucial to know exactly which disciple received the transmission from Hui Neng in order to decide on the authentic passage of the teaching. But as Yin Shun shows in his research, the idea of one transmission in each generation was not a central practice before the school of Shen Hui made it so. He reminds us that there are many expressions found in inscriptions and texts that indicate the multiplicity of the transmissions. Hung Zhen, the 5th patriarch, is quoted as saying, "I have taught many people in my life, the ones who transmit my Dharma becomes masters in their own places." Fa Hai, another famous master, is said to have had 10 disciples who received the transmission. The study of Korean Buddhism shows us that as the tradition of Chon was being passed into the peninsula, it came from a number of sources and transmissions. Once we see the Korean alongside the events of China and Japan, we can begin to spot just how multiple the transmissions were. The fact that the Korean Hangzhou school of Zen had as its founder Nanyue Haijong, 677 to 740, a little-known disciple of Hui Neng, immediately alerts us to fact that there was no one single transmission in the generation following Hui Neng, just as Yin Shun points out that there was no single transmission before Hui Neng's time. 2 of Hui Neng's disciples, Nanyi Huairang and Qingyuan Xingxi, who died in the 8th century, had formed the major transmissions. 2 were linked to Nanyu Hairang, Yuman and Kadong, and 3 to Xingxi, Viang, Linji, and Fian. While the idea of single transmission was put forward by the followers of Shen Hui, the idea did not take hold. It is an example of a concept that appears in the writings but not in practice. Korean Zen history is a good way to investigate the reality of how transmission was accomplished in the 9th century. It shows us that Buddhist history records multiple leaders, and a group of masters, all living and practicing at one time. Without multiple transmissions, it is hard to see how Seichin could have been spread to Korea or Japan. There was no feeling that the transmission from Huineng had to come through Shenhui. Huizhong and other disciples received and passed along the Dharma. As Yin Shun points out, Huineng was just one of the many who received the transmission from Hung Zhen, the fifth patriarch. Huirang was of great importance to the development of Chinese Seichin. From his lineage came the Viang, Linji, and Fayan schools, all dominant in the southern Sung. The Fayan school kept close ties to the court, and thus when the dynasty shifted, they were pushed aside as belonging to the past. Venerable Yu Fa in her dissertation from Yale indicates that the Linji came to the fore because they had no ties to the government and thus were free to spread. Once again, the fact that Huirang is so important in the development of the Seichin in China and that his tradition spread to Korea, means that the Korean Seon, Zen, is a valuable tool to looking backward to China to see the heritage that came to Korea in the Hangzhou school.